Welcome, beautiful souls, to Her True Stories, the channel where we dive deep into the raw, powerful stories of women who defied the odds, found their strength, and delivered a dose of unforgettable justice. Today, we're talking about a betrayal so profound, it struck at the very core of trust and family. Imagine standing at the funeral of a man you once loved, only for his new wife and children to publicly mock you, believing they've won everything. But what if that public humiliation, that searing pain, was the very spark that ignited a firestorm? A firestorm fueled by a hidden truth, a secret air, and an unshakable resolve, leading to a reckoning no one saw coming. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Get ready, because this is a journey of triumph you won't want to miss. My name is Dame Isabel Fletcher, and at 59 years old, I thought I had seen the worst of human cruelty. I was wrong. The Gothic cathedral bells tolled across London's grey autumn sky as mourners gathered for Sir Alistair Fletcher's funeral. The great man who had once been my husband lay in his mahogany coffin, surrounded by roses and lilies that could never mask the bitter irony of this day. I stood at the edge of the assembled crowd, dressed in elegant black, my silver hair swept back in a chignon that spoke of dignity rather than desperation. 23 years had passed since our divorce, but the wound of Alistair's betrayal had never fully healed. He had left me for Victoria, a woman 15 years younger, with legs that went on for miles and a smile that promised everything while meaning nothing. Their whirlwind romance had been the scandal of our social circle, splashed across every tabloid from London to Edinburgh. Now Victoria stood at the graveside, draped in designer black that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. At 48, she still possessed the kind of beauty that turned heads and emptied bank accounts. Her children, our children, I reminded myself bitterly, flanked her like sentries. Marcus, 22, had inherited his father's aristocratic bearing but none of his substance. Chloe, 19, was a carbon copy of her mother's calculated charm. They had never acknowledged me as anything more than an inconvenient relic of their father's past. As the vicar droned through the final prayers, I found myself thinking not of Alistair, but of Arthur Jr., my son, our son, who was attending his own father's funeral without knowing the truth of his parentage. At 24, Arthur had grown into a man of quiet integrity, working as a curator at a small museum in Edinburgh, living modestly on his salary and the small allowance I had been able to provide. He thought his father was a university professor who had died when he was young. It was the lie I had crafted to protect him from the truth. That his biological father was the same man being lowered into the ground today, surrounded by a family who would never accept him. The service concluded, and the assembled mourners began making their way to the reception at the Fletcher estate. I had debated whether to attend at all, but something deep inside me insisted I be there. Perhaps it was closure I sought, or perhaps it was simply the need to pay my respects to the man who had given me the greatest gift of my life, even if he never knew it. The Fletcher mansion looked exactly as I remembered it, imposing limestone walls covered in ivy, sweeping grounds that spoke of centuries of wealth and privilege. I had lived there once, had been mistress of this grand estate for 8 years before Victoria's arrival changed everything. The great hall buzzed with conversation as London's elite mingled over champagne and canapés. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, receiving polite nods from those who remembered me and curious glances from those too young to recall the scandal of my marriage's end. I was standing near the French doors that led to the garden when Victoria approached, her black Chanel suit perfectly tailored to her still stunning figure. Marcus and Chloe flanked her, their expressions a mixture of smugness and disdain that made my stomach turn. "Isabel," Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced sweetness that barely concealed venom. "How unexpected to see you here. I wasn't sure you'd received an invitation."
I hadn't te, I replid evenly.
but I felt it was important to pay my respects. Victoria's smile widened, and I saw the predator she had always been beneath the polished exterior. How touching. Though I hope you didn't come because of his 40 million fortune, because you will get nothing. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Seriously, why are you even here? Dad divorced you decades ago. You have no claim to anything. Chloe joined in, her young voice dripping with entitled malice. It's actually embarrassing, showing up like this. Don't you have any pride? Their laughter rang out across the reception hall, drawing curious glances from other guests. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, the same sensation I had experienced 23 years ago when Alistair had announced he was leaving me for this woman. But this time, I did not flinch. This time, I simply stood there with perfect composure, my hands clasped calmly in front of me, and waited. Because I knew something they didn't. Something that would change everything. You're quite right, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly despite its softness. I have no claim to Alistair's fortune. None whatsoever. Victoria's smile became triumphant. Finally, some sense. I was beginning to worry you'd try to contest the will or some other desperate.
Dame Isabelle Fletcher.
The voice that interrupted Victoria belonged to Mr. Davies, Alistair's longtime solicitor. He was a man of impeccable breeding and unshakable discretion, with silver hair and the kind of formal bearing that spoke of old-school legal training. Victoria turned toward him with obvious annoyance at the interruption. Yes, Mr. Davies? What is it? But Mr. Davies wasn't looking at Victoria. His attention was focused entirely on me, and in his hand, he carried a single thick envelope sealed with red wax. Dame Isabel, he said with a slight bow, Sir Alistair's final instructions. To be opened now, in your presence. The color drained from Victoria's face. What instructions? What are you talking about? Mr. Davies extended the envelope toward me, his expression grave but knowing. Sir Alistair was very specific about the timing, Dame Isabel. The funeral reception. In front of witnesses. I accepted the envelope with steady hands, feeling the weight of it, the significance of whatever lay within. Around us, the reception had grown quiet as guests sensed something momentous was about to unfold. The seal broke easily under my fingers, and I withdrew the documents within. My eyes scanned the first page, then the second, and I felt my heart begin to race despite my outward calm. This was it. This was the moment Alistair had planned for, the final act of a drama that had begun 24 years ago with a secret he had taken to his grave. What does it say? Victoria demanded, her voice rising with panic. What's in there? I looked up from the documents, meeting her eyes with perfect composure. Behind her, Marcus and Chloe had gone silent, their earlier confidence replaced by growing unease. Perhaps, I said quietly, you should read it yourself. And with those words, I handed Victoria the documents that would destroy her world forever. The moment Victoria's eyes fell upon the first document, her face underwent a transformation that would remain burned in my memory forever. The confident smirk disappeared, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then a horror so profound it was almost physical. This can't be right, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the reception guests who had begun to crowd around us, sensing drama. Marcus snatched the papers from his mother's trembling hands, his face flushing red as he read. This is fake, he declared loudly. This has to be some kind of fraud. But Mr. Davies stepped forward with the calm authority of a man who had spent 40 years managing the legal affairs of Britain's elite. I can assure you, Mr. Fletcher, that document is entirely authentic. Witnessed, notarized, and filed with the appropriate authorities precisely 3 weeks before your father's death. Chloe grabbed the papers from her brother, her young face contorting with confusion and rising panic. I don't understand. What does this mean? What is this? I watched the three of them pass the documents between themselves like a hot coal, each reading and rereading the words that would forever alter their lives. The irony was not lost on me. These people who had just finished mocking me for imagining I might have some claim to Alistair's fortune were now discovering that they themselves had no claim at all. The first document was Alistair's new will, dated just 3 weeks before his death. Unlike his previous will, which had left his entire £40 million estate to Victoria and her children, this final version was brutally specific in its disinheritance. Due to irreconcilable differences, profound betrayals of trust, and a complete lack of the familial respect and genuine love that should characterize a true family bond, I hereby revoke all previous bequests to my wife Victoria Fletcher and my children Marcus and Chloe Fletcher. Their actions over the past year have demonstrated beyond doubt that their affection for me extends only to my financial assets, and I refuse to reward such calculated manipulation. But it was the second document that would truly shatter their world. Who? Victoria said, her voice now shrill with desperation. Who is Arthur Fletcher Jr.? The reception hall had grown almost completely silent now. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 24 years of secrecy finally lifting from my shoulders. Arthur Fletcher Jr., I said clearly, my voice carrying across the hushed room, is Alistair's eldest son, his biological heir, the child he fathered with me during our marriage, before he ever met you, Victoria. The gasp that went up from the assembled guests was audible. I saw shocked faces turning to whisper urgently to their companions, saw phones being discreetly pulled out to capture what was clearly going to be the scandal of the decade. That's impossible, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad would have told us. We would have known. Your father knew, I replied calmly. He knew from the beginning. The birth certificate is right there in your hands, signed by Alistair himself as the acknowledging father. And indeed it was. The official record of Arthur's birth, dated 24 years ago, clearly listing Sir Alistair Fletcher as the father and Dame Isabel Fletcher as the mother. It had been sealed in Alistair's private papers all these years, waiting for this moment. Victoria was staring at the birth certificate as if it were written in a foreign language. But why? Why didn't he? Why keep it secret? Because I asked him to, I said simply. When Arthur was born, I was already planning to leave Alistair. I had discovered his first affair, not with you, Victoria, but with someone else entirely. I knew our marriage was over, but I didn't want my son growing up in the shadow of scandal and divorce proceedings. So we agreed to keep his parentage private. Alistair provided financial support through discreet channels, but publicly, Arthur was simply my son from a previous relationship that I preferred not to discuss. Mr. Davies cleared his throat. If I may, Dame Isabel, there are additional documents that confirm the financial arrangements Sir Alistair made over the years. He produced another folder from his briefcase, containing bank records, trust documents, and correspondence that painted a picture of a father who had been quietly supporting his secret son for over 2 decades. 24 years of monthly payments, Mr. Davies explained to the stunned crowd. University tuition, living expenses, even a small trust fund for Arthur's future. Sir Alistair may not have publicly acknowledged his son, but he never abandoned his responsibilities as a father. Chloe was crying now, tears streaming down her young face as the magnitude of what she was learning sank in. But what about us? What about everything Dad promised us? Your father promised you nothing, I said, my voice gentle but firm. He gave you a life of privilege and luxury for over 20 years. He paid for your education, your travels, your designer clothes, and expensive cars. but he owed you nothing beyond what he chose to give while he lived. This is insane, Marcus shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. You can't just show up after all these years with some secret son and steal our inheritance. I'm not stealing anything, I replied calmly. Arthur is simply claiming what was always rightfully his birthright as Alistair's eldest legitimate child. The crowd around us had grown larger as word of the drama spread throughout the reception. I could see faces I recognized from London's social pages, influential business leaders, members of parliament, all watching as one of England's wealthiest families imploded in spectacular fashion. Mr. Davies stepped forward again, his professional demeanor unshakable despite the chaos surrounding him. Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private, he suggested. There are additional details that need to be addressed. But Victoria was beyond caring about privacy or discretion. Her carefully maintained facade had cracked completely, revealing the desperate, grasping woman beneath. You planned this, she accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. You waited until he died, and then you sprung this trap. You're a manipulative, vindictive. I planned nothing, I interrupted, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. This was entirely Alistair's decision, made in the final weeks of his life, when he apparently had time to reflect on what truly mattered to him. But why now? Chloe sobbed. Why did he wait so long? Why didn't he tell us about Arthur before? I looked at the young woman with something approaching pity. For all her faults, Chloe was still barely more than a child, and she was learning truths that would reshape her understanding of everything she had believed about her father and her family. I think, I said quietly, your father was hoping you and Marcus would prove yourselves worthy of his legacy. That you would demonstrate genuine love and respect rather than simply waiting for him to die so you could inherit his money. The silence that followed was deafening. Around us, the reception guests stood frozen, afraid to move or speak, mesmerized by the unfolding drama. Finally, Victoria found her voice again, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Where is he? Where is this son of yours? I smiled for the first time since arriving at the funeral, a genuine expression of maternal pride that transformed my face. Arthur is driving down from Edinburgh as we speak, I said. He should be here within the hour. Mr. Davies contacted him this morning to inform him of his father's death and his inheritance. It will be the first time he learns the truth about his parentage. And with those words, I watched as Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe Fletcher began to understand that their lives as they had known them were about to end forever. The screaming would begin soon enough. The screaming began the moment the full implications of the documents sank into Victoria's consciousness. £40 million, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the reception hall. You're taking £40 million that belongs to my children. The assembled guests had given up all pretense of polite conversation now. This was better than any television drama, more scandalous than the juiciest tabloid headline, and it was happening right in front of them in real time. Marcus had gone pale as chalk, staring at the will as if he could change its contents through sheer force of will. This can't be legal, he said desperately. Dad wasn't in his right mind. He was sick, he was on medication. This is elder abuse. Mr. Davies opened his briefcase again and withdrew another folder, this one considerably thicker than the first. I anticipated such concerns, he said with the unflappable calm of a man who had handled explosive family revelations for decades. This folder contains comprehensive medical evaluations of Sir Alistair's mental state, conducted by 3 independent physicians in the weeks before he drafted his final will. I can assure you that he was of completely sound mind and under no undue influence whatsoever. Then why? Chloe sobbed, mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark rivulets. Why would he do this to us? We're his children. I found myself looking at this young woman with something approaching sympathy. For all her entitlement and cruelty, she was learning that the father she thought she knew had been essentially a stranger. Perhaps, I said gently, you should ask yourself what you did to earn such a dramatic change of heart from him. Victoria whirled on me with fury that was almost feral. Don't you dare lecture us about family loyalty. You abandoned him. You divorced him and disappeared from his life. I divorced him because he was unfaithful, I replied calmly. And I didn't disappear. I simply chose not to compete for his attention with his various mistresses. The crowd around us gasped. This was new information, a detail that hadn't been part of the public narrative when our marriage ended. That's a lie.
Victoria snarled.
Alistair never. Alistair was unfaithful throughout our entire marriage, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the hushed reception hall. You weren't his first affair, Victoria. You weren't even his second or third. You were simply the one he chose to marry after I finally had enough self-respect to leave. Mr. Davies cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may, there are additional documents that shed light on Sir Alistair's reasoning for his final decisions. He withdrew yet another set of papers from his seemingly bottomless briefcase. These are excerpts from Sir Alistair's private journal, written in the months before his death. He specifically requested that they be read in the event that his final will was contested. No, Victoria said desperately. I don't want to hear this. I don't want any of this. But Mr. Davies had already begun reading, his cultured voice carrying Alistair's final thoughts to the assembled crowd. I have spent the last year watching my wife and children, truly watching them for perhaps the first time in my life. What I have seen has filled me with profound disappointment and regret. Victoria speaks to me only when she wants something, a new piece of jewelry, a vacation, money for one of her endless shopping expeditions. She has no interest in my thoughts, my fears, my hopes for the future. To her, I am nothing more than a source of financing for her lifestyle. Marcus and Chloe are no better. They visit only when they need money, and they speak to me with barely concealed impatience, as if my very existence is an inconvenience they must endure until I have the courtesy to die and leave them my fortune. They have never once asked about my childhood, my struggles, my dreams. They know nothing about me as a person because they have never bothered to learn. Meanwhile, I have watched Isabel's son Arthur from a distance for 24 years. He believes his father was a university professor who died young, and he has built a life of meaning and purpose without any expectation of inheritance or privilege. He works in a small museum, preserving history for future generations, earning a modest salary that he supplements by giving lectures to tourists. He has never asked me for money because he doesn't know who I am. Yet in watching him, I see the man I once hoped to be, intelligent, principled, dedicated to something larger than himself. He is the son I failed to raise properly, the heir I should have acknowledged from the beginning. My legitimate children have shown me nothing but greed and contempt, while my secret son has shown me through his example what it means to live with integrity. I cannot leave my fortune to people who see me only as a source of money. But I can leave it to someone who has never asked for it, someone who will use it wisely because he understands the value of things that cannot be bought. The silence that followed Mr. Davies's reading was profound and terrible. I saw Victoria's face cycle through a dozen emotions: denial, rage, hurt, and finally a kind of broken understanding. He was spying on us, she whispered. He was watching us, judging us, planning this betrayal. He was hoping you would prove him wrong, I said quietly. Right up until the end, I think he was hoping you would show him genuine love instead of just wanting his money. Marcus suddenly exploded with rage, his young face twisted with fury and entitlement. This is bullshit. We loved him. We were there for him. Were you? I asked calmly. When was the last time you visited him just to spend time together, without asking for money? When was the last time you asked about his health, his feelings, his memories? When was the last time any of you treated him like a person instead of a bank account? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and I could see from their faces that they had no good answers. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably now, her young world collapsing around her. But what will happen to us? How are we supposed to live? The same way most people do, I replied without malice. By working, by taking responsibility for your own lives, by learning that the world doesn't owe you anything simply because you exist. Victoria's eyes had taken on a dangerous gleam, the look of a cornered animal. We'll fight this, she declared. We'll contest the will. We'll prove that you manipulated him, that you. You'll lose, Mr. Davies interrupted with quiet authority. Sir Alistair was exceptionally thorough. Every contingency has been considered, every potential challenge anticipated. The will is ironclad, and Arthur Fletcher Jr. is now the legal heir to the entire Fletcher fortune. As if summoned by his words, a commotion near the entrance to the reception hall drew everyone's attention. A young man had arrived, clearly travel-worn and confused, looking around the elegant gathering with the bewildered expression of someone who didn't understand why he'd been urgently summoned to London. Arthur Fletcher Jr. had arrived, and he was about to learn that his entire life was a lie. But it was a lie that was about to make him one of the wealthiest young men in England. Arthur Fletcher Jr. stood in the doorway of the reception hall like a man who had wandered into the wrong movie. At 24, he possessed the kind of understated handsomeness that spoke of good breeding tempered by genuine character. His brown hair was slightly mussed from the long drive, and his simple black suit was clearly off the rack rather than bespoke, marking him immediately as an outsider in this gathering of London's elite. His eyes found mine across the crowded room, and I saw the confusion and concern there. He had driven 400 miles at Mr. Davies's urgent request, told only that there had been a death in the family and his presence was required immediately. "Mum," he called out, his voice carrying the slight Scottish accent he had acquired during his years in Edinburgh. "What's going on? Why are we here?" The crowd parted as he made his way toward me, and I could see him registering the opulent surroundings, the well-dressed mourners, the obvious wealth that surrounded him. This was a world he had never been part of, had never even imagined being connected to. Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe watched his approach with expressions of horror and fascination, as if a ghost had materialized before their eyes. "Arthur," I said gently, reaching out to take his hands. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Before I could continue, Victoria erupted again, her composure finally shattered beyond repair. "That's him," she screamed, pointing at Arthur with a shaking finger. "That's the nobody who's stealing our inheritance? Look at him. He's nothing. He's a nobody museum worker who probably doesn't even own a proper suit." Arthur's eyes widened at the venom in her voice, and he instinctively stepped closer to me. "Mum, who is this woman? What is she talking about?" "Arthur," I said softly, ignoring Victoria's hysterics, "I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about your life." But before I could explain, Marcus had charged forward, his face red with rage and humiliation. "You think you can just waltz in here and steal what's ours? We've been part of this family for over 20 years. You're nothing. You're a bastard who doesn't even belong here." Arthur's expression darkened, and I saw a flash of the steel that lay beneath his gentle exterior. "I beg your pardon? I have no idea who you are or what you think I've stolen, but I won't stand here and be insulted by strangers." "Strangers?" Chloe laughed hysterically. "We're your half-siblings. Though I suppose that makes you the family's secret nobody wanted to acknowledge." The crowd around us had pressed closer, sensing that the drama was reaching its climax. I could see phones being raised, social media posts being composed in real time. This was going to be front-page news by morning. Mr. Davies stepped forward with admirable timing, his briefcase in hand and his expression grave. "Mr. Arthur Fletcher, Jr. I am Reginald Davies, your late father's solicitor. If I might have a word." "My father is dead," Arthur said firmly. "He died when I was 3 years old." "Professor Michael Henderson, University of Edinburgh." "I'm afraid not, sir," Mr. Davies said gently. "Your father was Sir Alistair Fletcher, and he died 3 days ago. You are here because you are his primary beneficiary." Arthur looked from Mr. Davies to me to the 3 strangers who were staring at him with undisguised hatred. "This is insane. Mum, tell them there's been some mistake." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 24 years of deception pressing down on me. "There's no mistake, my darling. Sir Alistair Fletcher was your biological father. I lied to you about Professor Henderson to protect you from this." I gestured at Victoria and her children, who were watching our conversation with expressions of absolute loathing. "You're lying," Arthur said desperately. "You're all lying. This is some kind of elaborate scam." Mr. Davies handed him the birth certificate, the DNA test results that Alistair had secretly obtained years earlier, and copies of the financial records showing decades of support payments. "I can assure you, sir, this is entirely legitimate. Your father left you his entire estate, approximately £40 million. Arthur stared at the documents as if they were written in hieroglyphics. 40 million, but why? Why would he leave me anything? I don't even know him." "Because," Victoria spat with pure venom, "your precious mother manipulated him on his deathbed. She poisoned his mind against his real family." "That's not true," I said firmly, but Victoria was beyond reason now. 23 years, she screamed at me. 23 years I was married to that man. I gave him the best years of my life. I gave him 2 beautiful children. And you destroyed it all with your lies and manipulation." Arthur was still staring at the documents, his face pale with shock. "Mum, is this real? Am I really—" "You're Sir Alistair Fletcher's son," I said gently. "His eldest son, actually. Born during my marriage to him, before I divorced him and left to protect you from exactly this kind of ugliness." The reception hall had erupted into chaos now. Guests were openly taking photos and videos, whispering urgently into phones, sharing the scandal in real time with the outside world. I could already imagine the headlines. "Secret heir emerges at Fletcher funeral. £40 million shock inheritance. The hidden son who inherited everything." Marcus and Chloe were clinging to each other, both crying now as the reality of their situation sank in. They had gone from being heirs to a £40 million fortune to being essentially penniless in the span of an hour. "We'll challenge this," Victoria declared wildly. "We'll prove that will is a fraud. We'll show that you manipulated a dying old man. You'll do nothing," I said with quiet authority, "because you have no grounds for challenge. No evidence of fraud, and no legal standing to contest a will that was properly witnessed and notarized by independent parties." Arthur was looking around the reception hall as if seeing it for the first time, taking in the obvious wealth, the elegant furnishings, the expensive clothes and jewelry worn by the guests. "This house," he said slowly. "This was his house. This was your house," I corrected gently. "It's part of your inheritance now. But where will we live?" Chloe sobbed. "This is our home. We've lived here our whole lives." Mr. Davies consulted his papers with professional efficiency. "The will specifies that the current residents have 120 days to vacate the premises and remove their personal belongings. All furniture, artwork, and household items remain with the property as part of the inheritance." The sound that emerged from Victoria's throat was barely human, a keening wail of loss and rage that echoed off the reception hall's ancient stones. "You did this," she accused, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "You planned this revenge for 23 years. You waited until he was dying and vulnerable, and then you struck. I did nothing, I replied calmly. This was entirely Alistair's decision, made in the final weeks of his life when he apparently had time to reflect on what family really means. Arthur was still processing the enormity of what he was learning. But why didn't he ever contact me? Why keep it secret all these years? Because I asked him to, I said honestly. When you were born, I was already planning to leave your father. I didn't want you growing up in the shadow of divorce proceedings and custody battles. I thought it would be better for you to have a simple, honest life than to be caught in the middle of our complicated situation. And now, Arthur asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Before I could answer, the reception hall doors burst open and a flood of reporters and photographers poured in, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, voices shouting questions. Mr. Fletcher, how does it feel to inherit £40 million? Dame Isabel, did you know about the secret will? Victoria, will you be challenging the inheritance? The story had broken. Within hours, it would be the lead item on every news program in Britain. The Fletcher family scandal would be dissected and analyzed, gossiped about, and sensationalized. And at the center of it all would be Arthur, my son, Alistair's heir, the secret that had finally been revealed. The screaming that Victoria had promised had indeed begun, but it would be nothing compared to the media frenzy that was about to consume all of our lives. The legal challenge began within 48 hours of the funeral reception, filed by Victoria's solicitors with a kind of desperate urgency that spoke of people who understood they were fighting for their very survival. I sat in Mr. Davies's elegantly appointed office in Lincoln's Inn, reading through Victoria's petition with something approaching fascination. The document painted me as a master manipulator who had spent decades plotting to steal the Fletcher fortune through emotional manipulation of a dying man. They're claiming undue influence, Mr. Davies observed dryly, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. Also mental incapacity, fraud, and, rather creatively, alienation of affection between Sir Alistair and his legitimate family. Arthur sat beside me, still looking overwhelmed by the rapid transformation of his circumstances. The past 2 days had been a whirlwind of legal meetings, media attention, and the surreal experience of being suddenly wealthy beyond imagination. Can they win? He asked quietly. Can they actually overturn the will? Mr. Davies smiled with the confidence of a man who had been practicing family law for 4 decades. Not a chance. Sir Alistair was extraordinarily thorough in his preparations. He anticipated every possible challenge and documented everything meticulously. He opened a thick folder that had become familiar over the past 2 days. Medical evaluations from 3 independent physicians confirming his complete mental competency. Video recordings of him explaining his reasoning in detail. Witness statements from his household staff describing his behavior and decision-making in the weeks before his death. Even a second DNA test, conducted just last month, confirming Arthur's parentage beyond any possible doubt. I found myself thinking of Alistair in those final weeks, methodically planning this revelation like the brilliant strategist he had been in business. He had always been thorough, but this level of preparation suggested something approaching obsession. There's something else, Mr. Davies continued, his expression growing more serious. Sir Alistair left additional documentation that, well, it doesn't paint Victoria and her children in a particularly flattering light. He withdrew another folder, this one marked Personal Observations, Confidential. He hired a private investigator, Mr. Davies explained. For the past year, he had been having his own family surveilled. The results were illuminating. Arthur looked uncomfortable. Isn't that illegal? Spying on your own family? Not when it's done on your own property by licensed professionals, Mr. Davies replied. And the results certainly explain his change of heart regarding his inheritance plans. He opened the folder to reveal photographs, transcripts, and detailed reports that painted a devastating picture of Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe's true feelings about Alistair. There were recordings of conversations between Victoria and her friends, where she complained bitterly about being trapped with an increasingly sick old man, counting down the days until his death would free her to spend his fortune. There were photographs of Marcus and Chloe meeting with financial advisors to discuss their expected inheritance, making elaborate plans for how they would spend their father's money before he was even dead. Father's money before he was even dead. Most damning of all were the transcripts of family conversations in the Fletcher mansion, captured by strategically placed recording devices. The callousness and greed displayed in those private moments was breathtaking. Victoria, I swear if he lives much longer, I'm going to lose my mind. Do you know how much money I could be making if I had access to those accounts? Instead, I'm stuck here playing nursemaid to a man who can barely remember my name half the time. Marcus. At least when he dies, we'll finally be free. 40 million pounds, Mum. We can do whatever we want. Chloe. I've already picked out the villa in Tuscany I want to buy. And that yacht in Monaco. God, I can't wait to be rich. Victoria. Just remember, when the lawyers read the will, act devastated. Cry appropriately. We need to maintain the image of the grieving family. Arthur had gone pale listening to these revelations. They were planning to inherit his money while actively wishing for his death? It appears so, Mr. Davies said gravely. Sir Alistair was apparently listening to these conversations for months. It's no wonder he decided to revise his will. I felt a complex mixture of emotions reading through Alistair's private documentation. Sadness for the man who had discovered his family's true nature in such a brutal way. Vindication that my instincts about Victoria had been correct all along. And a deep, protective anger on behalf of Arthur, who was learning just how much hatred and resentment had been directed at his existence. There's more, Mr. Davies continued. Sir Alistair also documented attempts by Victoria to accelerate his demise. Arthur and I both looked up sharply at this. Nothing directly criminal, Mr. Davies clarified quickly. But she had been researching his medications, consulting with doctors about his prognosis, and making inquiries about assisted dying programs in Switzerland. She was clearly hoping to hasten the timeline of his death. The picture that emerged from Alistair's investigation was of a family that had seen him as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial dreams. They had been going through the motions of care and affection while secretly resenting every day he continued to live. Meanwhile, Mr. Davies added, producing yet another folder, Sir Alistair was having you investigated as well, Arthur. He wanted to know what kind of man his secret son had become. Arthur shifted uncomfortably. What did he find? Nothing but positive reports. Your colleagues at the museum spoke of your dedication and integrity. Your friends described you as generous and principled. Your neighbors praised your quiet kindness and willingness to help others. Even your ex-girlfriend, when interviewed, said you were the most genuinely good person she had ever known. I felt a surge of maternal pride, mixed with sadness that Alistair had never had the chance to know Arthur personally. He was particularly impressed, Mr. Davies continued, by the incident last Christmas when you used your own savings to buy holiday gifts for the children of a colleague who had been laid off. And the fact that you volunteer at a homeless shelter in Edinburgh every weekend, despite your modest income. Arthur flushed with embarrassment. How could he possibly know about that? Because he was having you followed, observed, and investigated for the better part of a year, Mr. Davies explained. He wanted to be absolutely certain that if he left you his fortune, you would use it responsibly. The contrast between Arthur's character and that of Victoria's children was stark and undeniable. While Marcus and Chloe had been planning shopping sprees and luxury purchases, Arthur had been quietly living a life of service and integrity, unaware that he was being evaluated for the greatest inheritance in British family law history. The legal challenge will fail, Mr. Davies predicted with absolute confidence. No court in Britain will overturn a will when faced with this level of documentation. Victoria and her children have effectively provided written and recorded evidence of their own unworthiness. Over the following weeks, as the legal battle played out in the courts and the media, that prediction proved entirely accurate. Victoria's solicitors found themselves fighting an impossible case, defending clients whose own words and actions had condemned them. The transcripts of the recorded conversations were leaked to the press, creating a sensation that dominated the tabloids for days. The image of a family coldly calculating their inheritance while wishing for their patriarch's death was precisely the kind of scandal that the British public devoured with horrified fascination. "Death Wish Family," screamed the headline in The Sun. "The £40 million vultures," declared the Mirror. "Greed beyond the grave," proclaimed the Daily Mail. Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe found themselves pariahs overnight. Their social circle evaporated as friends and acquaintances distanced themselves from the scandal. Business associates canceled meetings. Exclusive clubs quietly revoked memberships. Meanwhile, Arthur was being hailed as the innocent victim who had inherited a fortune he never knew existed from a father he never knew he had. The media portrayed him as a modern-day Cinderella story, the humble museum curator who had become one of Britain's wealthiest young men overnight. "Prince Charming's surprise inheritance," read the headline in Hello magazine, alongside photos of Arthur looking uncomfortable but dignified outside the Edinburgh Museum, where he still insisted on working despite his newfound wealth. The legal proceedings became increasingly desperate as Victoria's team ran out of viable arguments. Each motion they filed was swiftly defeated by the mountain of evidence Mr. Davies presented. The medical evaluations, the witness statements, the recorded conversations, and the documented evidence of Victoria's family's callousness created an insurmountable case. 6 months after the funeral, the High Court issued its final ruling. Justice Margaret Thornton's words were devastating in their finality. The evidence presented in this case reveals a family so consumed by greed and so lacking in genuine affection that Sir Alistair Fletcher's decision to disinherit them appears not only reasonable but inevitable. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, mental incapacity, or fraud in the creation of Sir Alistair's final will. Arthur Fletcher Jr. is hereby confirmed as the sole and rightful heir to the Fletcher estate. Victoria's scream of anguish echoed through the courtroom, but it was the cry of a woman who had lost everything through her own choices. The battle was over. Arthur was legally and irrevocably the heir to £40 million. And Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe were left with nothing but the consequences of their own greed and cruelty. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and merciless. Within weeks of Justice Thornton's decision, Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe Fletcher found themselves completely exiled from the society they had once commanded. I observed their downfall from a comfortable distance, neither gloating nor intervening, simply watching as the natural consequences of their actions played out with inevitable precision. The first blow came from the Belmont Country Club, where Victoria had been a member for over 20 years. The letter was politely worded but devastating in its finality. "Due to recent circumstances that have brought unwanted media attention to our establishment, the board of directors has voted to terminate your membership effective immediately. Please arrange for the removal of your personal items from your locker at your earliest convenience." Similar letters followed from the Royal Opera House, the Cavalry and Guards Club, and every other exclusive institution where the Fletcher name had once commanded respect. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unreturned. The social network that had sustained Victoria's identity simply evaporated. Marcus and Chloe fared even worse. Their Cambridge and Oxford alumni associations quietly removed them from mailing lists. Job interviews that had been arranged through family connections were suddenly cancelled. The trust funds their father had established for their education were frozen pending legal review of their conduct. "They're treating us like criminals," Chloe sobbed during one of their family meetings, which I learned about through the same social connections that were rapidly abandoning them. "All we did was expect to inherit money from our own father." But that wasn't all they had done, and everyone knew it. The recorded conversations that had been released during the court proceedings had revealed the depths of their callousness. Social media was filled with commentary about the Death Wish family, as they had become known. Memes circulated showing Victoria checking her watch while supposedly caring for her dying husband, or Marcus and Chloe planning shopping sprees with inheritance money. The financial pressure began almost immediately. The Fletcher mansion, which they had been forced to vacate, had been their primary residence for over 2 decades. Victoria owned a small flat in Kensington that she had purchased before her marriage, but it was a far cry from the grand estate they had lost. Without access to Alastair's accounts, they discovered just how completely they had been living beyond their actual means. Victoria's personal finances were a disaster of credit card debt and store accounts, all predicated on the assumption that her husband's death would solve her money problems. "I can't afford the payments on the Bentley," Marcus confessed to his mother during another family crisis meeting. "Or the lease on my flat in Mayfair. Everything was based on expectations that aren't going to happen." The luxury cars were repossessed within a month. The expensive flats were abandoned when lease payments couldn't be met. Designer clothes were sold on consignment websites by people who had never imagined needing to worry about money. But perhaps most devastating of all was the way their relationships with each other began to fracture under the pressure. "This is all your fault," Marcus accused his mother during one particularly heated argument. "If you hadn't been so obvious about wanting Dad to die, maybe he wouldn't have cut us out of the will." "My fault," Victoria shrieked back. "You're the one who was planning to buy a yacht before your father was even buried." "At least I was discreet about my feelings." "Discreet?" Chloe laughed bitterly. "You were researching Swiss euthanasia clinics. How is that discreet?" The recordings had captured not just their greed, but their complete lack of genuine affection for Alastair. Listening to their own words played back in court had forced them to confront the ugliness of their true feelings, and none of them liked what they heard. Their attorney fees had consumed what little money they had managed to accumulate. The legal challenge had cost them nearly £200,000 in solicitor costs, expert witness fees, and court expenses, money they could no longer afford to spend. Victoria was forced to take a job for the first time in over 20 years, working as a sales associate in a high-end department store where she had once been a valued customer. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew her history. Marcus, whose planned career in investment banking had evaporated along with his family connections, found himself working in a call center, making minimum wage while trying to pay off the debts he had accumulated during his university years. Chloe, who had never held a job in her life, struggled to find employment of any kind. Her privileged background and complete lack of work experience made her unemployable in most fields, forcing her to accept a position as a waitress in a chain restaurant. The media followed their decline with gleeful fascination. Where are they now? Articles appeared regularly, documenting their reduced circumstances and obvious struggles. Meanwhile, Arthur was learning to navigate his new reality with characteristic grace and humility. He had retained his position at the Edinburgh Museum, though now as a part-time consultant rather than a full-time employee, allowing him to balance his passion for cultural preservation with his responsibilities as heir to the Fletcher fortune. "The money doesn't change who I am," he told reporters who continued to follow his story. "I'm still the same person I was before I learned about my father. I still believe in the value of preserving history and culture for future generations." He had, however, made some changes to his life. The cramped flat he had rented in Edinburgh was replaced by a comfortable house with enough space for a proper library and home office. He bought a reliable car to replace the aging bicycle he had been using for transportation. But his lifestyle remained fundamentally modest and thoughtful. More significantly, Arthur had begun the process of learning about his father and the business empire he had inherited. With Mr. Davies's guidance, he was gradually taking control of the various companies and investments that comprised the Fletcher fortune. "I feel a responsibility to honor my father's legacy," he explained during one of our regular dinners together. "Even though I never knew him personally, I want to understand what he built and ensure it continues to serve a positive purpose." The contrast between Arthur's measured response to wealth and his half-siblings' desperate pursuit of it could not have been more stark. While Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe had seen the Fletcher fortune as a means to fund their own indulgences, Arthur saw it as a trust that carried obligations and responsibilities. He had already begun making charitable donations, quietly supporting causes that aligned with his values. The homeless shelter where he volunteered received a substantial endowment. The museum where he worked was gifted funds for a new conservation laboratory. Scholarships were established for students. On the other side stood Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe, increasingly isolated and struggling with the consequences of their own choices. The scales of justice had balanced themselves with elegant precision. 2 years after the funeral that changed everything, the full magnitude of Victoria's family's destruction had become clear. Their legal defeat had been total, their social exile complete, and their financial ruin absolute. I learned the details of their decline through the same society networks that had once sustained them, though now those connections spoke of the Fletcher family with a mixture of pity and disgust. Victoria had been forced to sell her Kensington flat to pay legal debts and was now living in a cramped bedsit in South London. The woman who had once commanded staff of 12 in a Mayfair mansion was now sharing a bathroom with strangers and cooking meals on a single electric burner. Her job at Harrods had ended in humiliation when customers began recognizing her from the tabloid photos and asking pointed questions about her inheritance battle. "Aren't you the woman who wished her husband would die?" one particularly bold shopper had asked, loud enough for other customers to hear. The stress of her reduced circumstances was taking a visible toll. Friends who occasionally spotted her around London reported that she had aged dramatically, her designer clothes replaced by obvious charity shop purchases, her perfectly maintained appearance showing signs of strain and neglect. Marcus had fared no better. His dreams of a career in finance had been permanently derailed by the scandal. No respectable firm would hire someone associated with the Death Wish family publicity nightmare. He had cycled through a series of increasingly menial jobs, unable to maintain employment once his identity became known. The debt he had accumulated during his university years, student loans, credit cards, personal loans all taken out in anticipation of his inheritance, had grown into an insurmountable burden. He was forced to declare bankruptcy at age 24, a humiliation that followed him in every job application and rental agreement. "He's living in a shared house in Croydon now," Lady Pemberton told me during one of our charity committee meetings. 4 flatmates, all under 25, all working in call centers or retail. Can you imagine? From heir to a £40 million fortune to sharing a kitchen with teenagers earning minimum wage. Chloe's situation was perhaps the most tragic, though no less deserved. At 21, she was struggling with the reality that her entire identity had been built around being Sir Alistair Fletcher's daughter and heiress. Without that foundation, she seemed to have no sense of who she was or what she wanted from life. Her job as a waitress had lasted only 6 months before she was fired for poor attendance and a bad attitude. She had been living with various friends and boyfriends, moving frequently as relationships soured under the pressure of her financial needs and emotional instability. "She's become quite desperate," reported Mrs. Ashworth, whose daughter had known Chloe at school. "Showing up at parties uninvited, trying to reconnect with old friends who clearly don't want anything to do with her. It's rather pathetic, really." The family's relationships with each other had continued to deteriorate as their circumstances worsened. The recordings from Alistair's investigation had revealed not just their attitudes toward him, but their willingness to betray each other when convenient. Marcus blamed his mother for the family's downfall, pointing to her careless comments about wishing Alistair would die. Victoria blamed her children for their obvious greed and lack of discretion. Chloe blamed everyone but herself, insisting that she had been an innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control. They barely speak to each other anymore, Mr. Davies reported during one of our quarterly meetings about Arthur's affairs. The few times they've been spotted together, witnesses report they spend the entire time arguing about whose fault their situation is. The contrast with Arthur's flourishing life could not have been more stark. He had settled into his role as heir to the Fletcher fortune with remarkable grace, balancing his responsibilities as a wealthy man with his commitment to meaningful work and genuine values. The Edinburgh Museum had promoted him to Senior Curator Emeritus, a prestigious position that allowed him to lead major research projects while maintaining the flexibility to manage his philanthropic responsibilities. He had used his resources to fund several important research projects and had become a respected figure in cultural preservation. Arthur hosted a dinner last week for the British Museum Board, I told Lady Pemberton during one of our conversations. 20 of the most distinguished scholars and curators in Britain discussing strategies for protecting cultural heritage. He's exactly the kind of thoughtful, responsible heir that Sir Alistair hoped for. Meanwhile, Victoria's attempts to reconnect with her former social circle had been uniformly unsuccessful. She had tried attending charity events where she had once been welcomed, only to find herself quietly excluded from conversations and diplomatically avoided by former friends. She showed up at the Children's Hospital Gala, Mrs. Ashworth reported with barely concealed distaste, wearing what was obviously a borrowed dress, trying to act as if nothing had changed. The poor dear didn't seem to understand that her presence was making everyone uncomfortable. The recorded conversations that had destroyed their legal case continued to haunt them in social situations. Everyone knew exactly what Victoria and her children had said about Alistair in private, and the callousness of those remarks had permanently tainted their reputations. "How do you come back from wishing your husband would die?" Lady Pemberton had asked rhetorically. "How do you rebuild relationships when everyone knows you were planning to spend inheritance money before the man was even buried?" The answer, it seemed, was that you didn't. Some betrayals were simply too profound for society to forgive or forget. Arthur, meanwhile, had begun making subtle inquiries about his father's life and character, trying to understand the man he had never known. Through Mr. Davies and former business associates, he was learning about Alistair's philanthropic work, his business principles, and his personal struggles. "I'm discovering that he was more complex than I expected," Arthur told me during one of our weekly dinners. "He made mistakes, obviously, but he also did a great deal of good. I want to honor that legacy while learning from his errors." The Fletcher business empire was thriving under Arthur's ownership, guided by a board of experienced executives, but increasingly influenced by his ethical perspectives. Several companies had improved their environmental practices, employee benefits had been enhanced, and charitable giving had increased substantially. "Your father would be proud," I told him. "You're everything he hoped you would become." The public perception of the Fletcher name had undergone a complete transformation. Where once it had been associated with scandal and greed, it was now connected with Arthur's quiet dignity and responsible stewardship. The media had largely lost interest in Victoria and her children, focusing instead on Arthur's positive contributions to society. "The rightful heir proves his worth," read a recent headline in the Times, accompanying an article about Arthur's latest charitable initiative. Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe had become footnotes in their own family story, cautionary tales about the consequences of greed and the importance of genuine character. Their brief moment of public attention had passed, leaving them in the shadows of obscurity and reduced circumstances that seemed likely to be permanent. The bitter harvest of their betrayal was complete, and the seeds they had sown in cruelty and selfishness had grown into exactly the crop they deserved. 3 years into his inheritance, Arthur had transformed from a modest museum curator into one of Britain's most respected young philanthropists, though he wore his new status with characteristic humility. I sat in the conservatory of Blenheim House, the Fletcher family's country estate that Arthur had decided to restore rather than sell, watching my son review applications for the newly established Fletcher Foundation. The morning light caught the gold in his brown hair, and I was struck by how much he resembled his father in his moments of deep concentration. "Mom, look at this application," he said, his voice filled with the excitement that always accompanied his discovery of a worthy cause. "A young woman from Manchester who wants to become an art conservator but can't afford the specialized training. Her portfolio is extraordinary." Arthur had established the Fletcher Foundation with an initial endowment of £10 million, focusing on education and cultural preservation. Unlike the flashy charitable galas that dominated London society, Arthur's philanthropy was quiet, thoughtful, and devastatingly effective. "She reminds me of myself at that age," he continued, studying the application materials. "Passionate about preserving history, but without the resources to pursue proper training. This is exactly the kind of opportunity the Foundation should support." The transformation in Arthur's life had been remarkable to witness. The cramped Edinburgh flat had been replaced by tasteful residences in London and Scotland, but he had chosen properties that reflected his values rather than his wealth. The London townhouse was elegant but not ostentatious, filled with books and artwork rather than expensive gadgets. The Scottish estate was a working property where he was experimenting with sustainable farming practices. More importantly, Arthur had found his purpose in being a steward rather than simply an owner of wealth. Every business decision was filtered through questions of ethical impact and social responsibility. The Fletcher companies had become leaders in fair labor practices and environmental sustainability. "I received a letter from one of our scholarship recipients," Arthur told me, pulling out a handwritten note. "She's graduated from university now and working as a social worker in Birmingham. She says the scholarship didn't just pay for her education, it gave her hope that someone believed in her potential." This was the kind of feedback that energized Arthur far more than any business profit report. He had quickly learned that true wealth wasn't measured in bank balances, but in positive impact on other people's lives. The restoration of Blenheim House had become a symbol of Arthur's approach to his inheritance. Rather than simply enjoying the grand estate as a personal residence, he had opened portions of it to the public, creating educational programs about British history and culture. The gardens had been transformed into a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture techniques. "Your father always said this house was meant to serve a purpose beyond personal comfort," Mr. Davies had told Arthur during the planning stages. He would be delighted to see it being used to educate and inspire others. Arthur had also begun the delicate process of learning about Alastair's character from people who had known him well. The picture that emerged was complex but ultimately sympathetic, a man who had made mistakes in his personal life, but who had been genuinely committed to building something meaningful through his business ventures. "He started from nothing, you know," Arthur's Uncle David had explained during one of their meetings. "Your grandfather was a coal miner. Alastair built this entire empire through intelligence and determination. He never forgot his working-class roots, even after he achieved success." This knowledge had influenced Arthur's approach to philanthropy, focusing particularly on creating opportunities for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Fletcher Foundation's motto had become "Unlocking Potential," and its programs were designed to identify and support talented individuals who lacked access to traditional pathways to success. The contrast with his half-siblings' attitudes toward wealth could not have been more profound. Where Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe had seen money as a means to personal indulgence, Arthur saw it as a tool for creating positive change. I keep thinking about that Bible verse Arthur had told me recently. To whom much is given, much is expected. I didn't ask for this inheritance, but since I have it, I want to use it in ways that honor both my father's memory and my own values. The social acceptance that had always eluded Victoria came naturally to Arthur precisely because he didn't seek it for its own sake. His genuine character and thoughtful approach to wealth made him a sought-after presence at charitable events and cultural institutions. Young Fletcher is exactly what this country needs, Lord Pemberton had declared at a recent dinner party. Wealth combined with wisdom, success tempered by service. He's proof that the aristocratic ideal can still mean something positive in the modern world. Arthur had been invited to join the boards of several prestigious institutions, the National Gallery, the British Museum, the Royal Opera House, not because of his money, but because of his demonstrated commitment to cultural preservation and his fresh perspective on traditional institutions. Perhaps most satisfying of all was watching Arthur develop relationships with other members of our extended family. My brother and his children, who had always been kind but somewhat distant, now welcomed Arthur warmly into family gatherings. He was building the kinds of genuine connections that Victoria and her children had never achieved despite their years of proximity to wealth. It's wonderful to see him becoming the man his father hoped he would be, my sister-in-law had observed. You raised him well, Isabel. Alistair's money couldn't have gone to a more deserving person. The Fletcher name, which had been tarnished by the inheritance scandal, was being rehabilitated through Arthur's actions. Business publications wrote admiringly about his ethical leadership. Cultural institutions praised his support for education and preservation. Even tabloid newspapers, which had once feasted on the family drama, now portrayed him as a positive role model. From secret heir to society's golden boy, read a recent headline in Tatler, accompanying a feature about Arthur's charitable work. Meanwhile, Victoria's attempts to reconnect with the Fletcher legacy had been consistently rebuffed. She had tried contacting Arthur through intermediaries, hoping to establish some kind of relationship that might provide her with financial support. But Arthur had politely but firmly declined any contact with the family that had so thoroughly rejected his existence. They had 24 years to acknowledge me, Arthur had said when Mr. Davies informed him of Victoria's overtures. They chose not to. Now that choice has consequences. It was a mature perspective from a young man who had every reason to be bitter about his exclusion from his father's life. But Arthur had channeled his energy into building something positive rather than dwelling on past hurts. The true Fletcher legacy was being written now, not in terms of inherited wealth or social position, but in Arthur's commitment to using his advantages to benefit others. It was exactly the kind of legacy that Alistair had hoped for when he made his final will, and exactly the opposite of what Victoria and her children would have created. Arthur had proven himself worthy of his inheritance, not through accident of birth, but through the character he had developed and the choices he made every day. He was living proof that sometimes the greatest gifts come to those who never expected them, and that true nobility is measured not by what you have, but by what you do with what you're given. 5 years had passed since the funeral that destroyed one family and elevated another, and the full consequences of that day's revelations had settled into permanent reality. I learned of Victoria's latest desperate attempt through Mrs. Ashworth, who had encountered her at a charity shop in Clapham where Victoria was attempting to sell a designer handbag, one of the last remnants of her former life. She looked absolutely dreadful, Mrs. Ashworth reported with the kind of horrified fascination reserved for witnessing the mighty fallen. Thin, poorly dressed, with that desperate look of someone who's given up on maintaining appearances. She was arguing with the shop clerk about the bag's value, insisting it was worth hundreds when they were offering her £20. The image was heartbreaking in its symbolism, a woman who had once commanded rooms full of London's elite now haggling over pocket change in a second-hand shop. But Victoria's physical decline was nothing compared to the psychological torment she had endured. The weight of knowing that she had possessed everything and thrown it away through her own callousness had eaten away at her like acid. Marcus and Chloe had fared no better in the years since their disinheritance. Marcus, now 27, had developed a drinking problem that had cost him several jobs and most of his remaining relationships. He lived alone in a council flat in East London, surviving on benefits and the occasional temporary employment. He was spotted outside the Fletcher Foundation offices last month, Mr. Davies reported during one of our meetings. Security had to escort him away when he became belligerent about wanting to see Arthur. Apparently, he was quite intoxicated and claiming that the inheritance rightfully belonged to him. Chloe's situation was perhaps even more tragic. At 24, she had never learned to support herself independently and had cycled through a series of increasingly unstable living situations. Her attempts to trade on her former status had failed completely as the scandal of her family's downfall followed her everywhere. She tried to contact several of Arthur's friends. I learned through the social network that still kept me informed of such matters, claiming she wanted to apologize and rebuild family relationships. Of course, everyone saw through it immediately. She was quite obviously hoping for financial support. Their desperate attempts to reconnect with Arthur had become increasingly pathetic. Letters arrived regularly at the Fletcher Foundation, each more pleading than the last, begging for mercy, for a chance to make amends, for some small portion of the inheritance they felt they deserved. Arthur read each letter carefully, his expression growing sadder with each desperate plea, but his resolve never wavered. "I feel sorry for them," he told me after receiving a particularly heartbreaking letter from Chloe. "But feeling sorry for someone doesn't mean enabling their poor choices. They had 24 years to develop character and integrity. Instead, they chose greed and cruelty. I can't fix that for them." The most devastating blow to their remaining pride had come the previous year, when Victoria attempted to attend the gala opening of the Fletcher Foundation's new cultural center. Security, acting on Arthur's instructions, had quietly prevented her entry, a humiliation that had been witnessed by several society figures who had once been her friends. She actually tried to argue that she should be admitted as a member of the Fletcher family, Lady Pemberton had reported with obvious distaste. Can you imagine the audacity? After everything that family did, trying to claim association with Arthur's success? But perhaps most crushing of all was the growing recognition that their exile was permanent. The London society that had once welcomed them would never accept them back. The wealth they had counted on was gone forever. The family name they had hoped to inherit belonged now to someone who wanted nothing to do with them. Victoria had attempted suicide 18 months earlier, taking an overdose of sleeping pills in her bedsit. She had been found by her landlord and rushed to hospital, where she was saved but left with lasting health complications. She told the crisis counselor that she couldn't live with the knowledge of what she had lost, the hospital's social worker had reported. She kept saying that she had been so close to having everything, and now she had nothing. The guilt and regret were overwhelming her completely. Their relationships with each other had completely disintegrated under the pressure of their shared failure. Victoria blamed her children for their obvious greed, while Marcus and Chloe blamed their mother for her careless words about wishing Alistair would die. "They're like crabs in a bucket," Mrs. Ashworth observed with clinical precision, "each one trying to climb out by pulling the others down. It's quite pathetic to witness." The final insult had come when Arthur announced his engagement to Sarah Chin, the daughter of a prominent family of art collectors. The wedding would be the social event of the season, held at Westminster Abbey with a reception at the Natural History Museum. Victoria, Marcus, and Chloe would not be invited, of course. They would read about it in the society pages like any other strangers, watching the heir to their former fortune celebrate with the life and happiness that might have been theirs if they had made different choices. Their despair was total, their isolation complete, and their prospects for redemption non-existent. They had made their bed with cruelty and greed, and now they would lie in it forever. 7 years had passed since Sir Alistair Fletcher's funeral, and the world had settled into a new order that reflected the true values of character over entitlement, integrity over inheritance. I stood in the rose garden of Blenheim House, watching Arthur and Sarah's 3-year-old daughter Emma chase butterflies among the carefully tended blooms. The sight filled my heart with a joy I had never expected to experience, the profound satisfaction of watching a legacy built on genuine love and principled choices flourish across generations. "Grandmama Isabel, look," Emma called out in her clear, bright voice, holding up a dandelion she had picked. "I found a wishing flower." "Make a good wish, darling," I replied, marveling at how this child embodied everything that Victoria's children might have been if they had been raised with different values. Arthur emerged from the house, carrying a tea tray and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that spoke of a man completely comfortable with his choices and their consequences. At 31, he had grown into his role as one of Britain's most respected philanthropists, but more importantly, he had become exactly the kind of husband and father that his own father had failed to be. "The Fletcher Foundation board meeting went well," he reported, settling the tray on the garden table. "We've approved funding for 12 new scholarships this quarter, including that young conservator from Manchester I mentioned. She'll be starting her training at the Victoria and Albert Museum next month." This was Arthur's greatest achievement, not the accumulation of wealth, but its thoughtful distribution in ways that created lasting positive change. The Fletcher Foundation had become one of Britain's most respected charitable organizations, known for its rigorous selection process and transformative impact on recipients' lives. Sarah joined us in the garden, her architect's eye automatically assessing the restoration work that continued to transform the estate into a model of sustainable heritage preservation. Her marriage to Arthur had been based on shared values and genuine affection, everything that Alistair's marriage to Victoria had lacked. "The Museum Visitors Centre is almost complete," she reported. "We should be able to open to the public next spring. The educational programs alone will impact thousands of students each year." Emma ran over with her dandelion, now transformed into a globe of seeds ready to take flight. "I wished for ice cream," she announced seriously, "and for everyone to be happy." The innocence of her wish struck me as profoundly symbolic. This child, who would inherit not just money but a tradition of service and responsibility, was already thinking about others' happiness alongside her own simple pleasures. Meanwhile, the other side of the Fletcher family had faded into well-deserved obscurity. Victoria, now 55, worked part-time at a charity shop in South London, her beauty long since ravaged by stress and regret. Marcus had found some stability working as a night security guard, though his drinking remained a problem. Chloe had married a man she met in a support group for gambling addicts, and they lived in a council flat with their 2 young children, surviving on benefits and minimum wage jobs. "Do you ever think about them?" Sarah asked me during one of our regular conversations. "I think about them as cautionary tales," I replied honestly. "They serve as perfect examples of how not to live, how not to treat family, how not to value what truly matters." The Fletcher name had been completely rehabilitated under Arthur's stewardship. Where once it had been associated with scandal and greed, it now represented thoughtful philanthropy and responsible wealth management. "I received a letter yesterday from our very first scholarship recipient," Arthur continued. "She's now a practicing physician in Glasgow, specializing in serving low-income communities. She wrote to thank the foundation and to announce that she's establishing her own scholarship fund for medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, I watched my son play with his daughter and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and a justice perfectly served. Arthur had become everything his father had hoped for and everything his half-siblings never could have been. The secret heir had proven himself the rightful heir in every way that mattered, and the Fletcher name would be honored for generations to come, not because of what it had inherited, but because of what it had given to the world. This was my triumph, my vindication, and my peace. And that, my friends, is the power of a woman who is publicly shamed but found her strength, her voice, and her ultimate victory in the most unexpected way. Dame Isabel's journey reminds us that even when betrayal cuts deepest, we can find the courage to fight back, to reclaim our dignity, and to build a legacy that truly matters. Her story shows us that justice sometimes comes not through revenge, but through the simple act of allowing people to reap exactly what they have sown. Arthur's transformation from secret son to respected heir proves that true nobility comes from character, not birthright, and that the greatest inheritance we can leave is not money, but values. If Dame Isabel's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of integrity over entitlement, then hit that subscribe button, join the Her True Stories family, and let's continue to share these incredible tales of resilience and triumph together. Until next time, stay strong, stay true to your values, and remember, the best revenge is living well and watching justice serve itself.